Last week, a Georgia community was left shattered after a gunman opened fire into a high school, killing 4 and wounding several others. The horrific attack was allegedly at the hands of a 14-year-old student who reportedly confessed to the shooting. Then, in a stunning turn, the suspected gunman's father was also charged, accused of allowing his son to possess the weapon used in the shooting. On Wednesday, September 4th, for many students, teachers, and staff at Apalachee High School in Barrow County, Georgia, the day seemingly started as any other school day. That is until the words "hard lockdown" appeared on school screens, along with flashing lights, signaling every student, teacher, and staff member's worst nightmare. According to students, 14-year-old Colt Gray was in his morning algebra class when he left the classroom, at first believed to be skipping the class. But when he returned, he was reportedly armed with a semi-automatic assault rifle. One student recalled hearing 10 or 15 gunshots back to back. As students piled desks and chairs in front of their doors to make a barricade in fear of their lives, authorities say the shooting suspect murdered 4 people, 2 freshman students and 2 teachers. 9 others were injured. Of those 9, 7 of them were shot. While many questions remain, including a motive and how the student was able to smuggle in a semi-automatic weapon into the school, several families are left reeling from the devastating loss of their loved ones. Here's what we know about the victims of last week's school shooting. 14-year-old Mason Skirmerhorn is remembered by his loved ones as a sweet and loving soul with the biggest smile. His sister told Fox 5 Atlanta he loved all things fun and games, including his PlayStation 5 virtual reality headset, and was learning how to play the trumpet to be just like his older sister. At the time of the shooting, he reportedly texted his mom that he went to the restroom. While initially believing her son to be okay, she heard the devastating news that her son was one of the victims. While Mason's family still is left heartbroken after his life was cut too short, his sister told the outlet she hopes she can keep his memory alive to stay strong and live life just like he would want her to. Mason's classmate, 14-year-old Christian Angelo, was also tragically killed in last week's shooting. According to a GoFundMe page, Christian's sister paid tribute to her baby brother, remembering him as a good kid who was very sweet and caring. The Apalachee High freshman reportedly was a free spirit who loved to make others laugh. He's described as also having a chill demeanor, but was full of life and energy. It's unclear where within the school Christian was when he was killed by the suspected gunman. In an interview with Univision, his mother said she remembered the final moment she saw her son before he went off to school. She said Christian gave his father and her a hug, a moment that she now carries in her heart. Christina Aramy, a math teacher at Apalachee High, was celebrating her birthday with her students on the day she was shot and killed. A friend of hers told CNN she decided to bake a cake and bring pizza to her class on the day she died. Aramy was known as a beloved math teacher who was dedicated to her students and treated them like her own. One student told CBS Mornings she was a real nice teacher who liked to tell jokes and never made students feel less than. The student said, "You could get a question wrong on the board, and she's not going to make you feel dumb. She will make you feel welcome." A relative of Aramy told CNN Aramy's path to teaching began in 2012 after her husband encouraged her to go back to school to do something she loved. Aramy reportedly moved to the United States in 1996 from Romania, where she was a professional folkloric dancer. And on weekends, her teaching didn't stop, as she combined her love of teaching and dance, as she was also a dance teacher at her local church. Aramy's colleague and fellow math teacher Richard Aspinwall was also tragically killed in last week's shooting. The father of 2 was known to his students as sweet, kind, and a good guy. One student told ABC Aspinwall was his favorite teacher. The student said he was so chill. He will make sure you do the work, but he'll also make sure you have fun. In addition to teaching math, he was also the defensive coordinator for the school's football team, known as Coach A to the players. When the suspected gunman opened fire in the school, one student described to ABC News the final moments he saw Aspinwall alive. The student described when Aspinwall heard the gunshots, he opened the door and ran outside to see what was going on. Shortly after, he was found lying prone in the doorway of the classroom as he tried to crawl back to his students. One of the students reportedly got the courage to help Aspinwall and dragged his body into the classroom as students were crying, seeing their beloved teacher take his final breaths. According to his obituary, Aspinwall was proud to be Coach A to many. He loved his students and players. For Aspinwall, it was more than football to him. It was about creating a positive sense of community and being a role model for the kids. And his pride and joy was his family. He was a devoted husband to his wife and the ultimate girl dad to his 2 little girls. The shooting has left many families now planning for funerals and others now planning for a long road to recovery. 9 others were injured in last Wednesday's shooting, and here's what we know about the surviving victims. 15-year-old Natalie Griffith was in her algebra class when the shots were fired. Her father told Fox 5 Atlanta she was hit at least 2 times. One of the bullets went through her arm and one across the chest, and the most damaging shot was to her wrist. Medics rushed her to the hospital where she had extensive surgery to be able to save part of her arm, and doctors had to reconstruct her wrist, as her family now hopes there's no long-term effects. The 15-year-old even plans to go back to Apalachee High School after her recovery. 15-year-old Melanie Garcia was also named as one of the shooting survivors. According to GoFundMe, Melanie was shot in the shoulder and will have to have 2 surgeries, as the bullet broke the bone that connects the shoulder to her arm. A family friend wrote, "Her life will forever be changed, and her childhood has been stripped from her." The post went on to state she's a normal young teen who loved to be with friends, play soccer, and spend time with family, and none of those hobbies will ever be the same. Taylor Jones, also a student, was life flighted to Grady Hospital after the shooting and had to undergo a long surgery due to the injury she sustained. Her family says she still has a long road ahead with more surgeries and extensive physical therapy. And special education math teacher David Phoenix was among the first of the surviving victims to be identified. According to his daughter Katie, he was shot in the foot and hip, and his hip bone was left shattered. When he arrived to the hospital, he was alert and awake, and thankfully made it out of his surgery and was in stable condition. But Phoenix's GoFundMe page would reveal more heartbreaking details. According to the page, Phoenix was shot protecting his students with Richard Aspinwall, and the two were together when he was shot and killed. When Phoenix woke up from his surgery, he reportedly asked, "Is everyone else okay?" It's unclear at this time if the suspected shooter targeted the victims or if they were horrific chance encounters. After the shooting, a school resource officer found the shooter, who surrendered shortly before 10:30 a.m. that morning. 14-year-old Colt Gray, who is charged as an adult, now faces 4 counts of felony murder. His father, Colin Gray, was also charged and arrested in the case. He's charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 2 counts of second-degree murder, and 8 counts of cruelty to children. I'm now joined by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Daniel Bober. Dr. Bober, thank you for joining me today. This shooting was shocking and happened just about a month after school began. What are your thoughts about what we know so far about the shooting?
Well, it's a situation again where our sense of security and safety has been shaken beneath us. We don't have to live this way, but it has become a normal, everyday part of our lives. And it seems like in this particular case, this individual was someone that should not have had access to weapons, if but for his father, who knew that he was suffering from mental health challenges, but still allowed him to obtain the weapon. Now, obviously, I don't have firsthand information of that, but that seems to be what the reports would indicate.
And at this time, authorities haven't identified a motive for the shooting, so it's unclear if the victims were targeted. But what do you think? Was it a terrible chance encounter or a targeted attack?
Well, I think the line between those two options is blurred, right? I mean, most people that commit these crimes, a lot of people are out there saying it's all mental illness or it's all mental illness. But the thing is, a lot of this is really people in crisis, right? Sometimes it's people who are actually feeling suicidal, who actually want to end their lives and take as many people with them. And in their last desperate act, it's the only time they actually feel empowered. But in this particular case, we're talking about a 14-year-old suspect. Now, we know that a 14-year-old's brain is not fully formed yet. They do not weigh the future consequences of their actions. They aren't able to put the brakes on, so to speak, control their impulses. So I think we have to consider this within a developmental context as well.
And I can't even imagine how the shooting victims and their families feel right now. And the shooting victims, I'm saying the surviving victims as well, and how they feel, as well as their families, how they're processing something like this that's just so horrific, something like this that had happened to children as well as teachers as well too. And if a victim's family member were to see you for help, what would that be like, and what would that entail?
So I would look for signs of acute stress or possibly the development of PTSD. When something like this occurs, the initial reaction is shock and disbelief, intense fear, anxiety, sometimes a numbing feeling. Sometimes it can present as physical symptoms. In younger children, it can present as acting out, having stomach aches, feeling nauseous, or sometimes even freezing or what we call dissociation, where we disconnect from our thoughts and our emotions. And we would look for signs of PTSD like hypervigilance, meaning going to a new place, scanning the area for threats, um, looking at people avoiding certain situations, nightmares. All these things are symptoms of potential PTSD that can develop over time.
And for those who survived the shooting and are on the road to recovery, what does that process look like for them, especially mentally?
So, trauma is not a singular event, it's a process and it takes time. And very often, it requires redefining your life and redefining your place in your life. You know, interestingly enough, a lot of people that I've met who've undergone serious trauma, if you pose them the question and you say to them, if I could go back and erase your trauma and undo it like it never happened, would you want me to do that? A lot of them, believe it or not, will say no because the trauma redefines them as a person, and sometimes they come out on the other end of that even more resilient than when they started.
And from what we know so far, some of the shooting victims who survived the attack plan on actually coming back to Apalachee High School, which I do think is incredibly brave. What could that look like the moment that, these students or even the teachers step foot inside that school again after something just so horrific and tragic happened to them there?
So there are a number of modalities that we would employ in a situation like this. One is called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, where we look at cognitive restructuring and cognitive reframing and exposure. And when we talk about exposure, that's exactly what you're talking about. Sending them back to the place where the trauma occurred and doing it in a graded way where we can desensitize them to those feelings, and avoidance just continues to perpetuate the problem. So it really is important sometimes when you undergo a trauma like that to slowly, with support, get back into the game again, so to speak, to get back to the place where it happened, but to do so again with careful guidance in a very controlled way.
And is there ever I guess the term going back to normal, is that even really a thing in these types of circumstances?
Well, I think it's a new normal, right? In our field, normal is a very relative term. So I think you have to redefine your normal. It's like changing the thermostat on the air conditioning. It's a different kind of normal where you have to redefine your life, and in some way, it may be a richer life and a more fulfilling life, and that can happen after trauma.
And for the students who weren't injured in the attack and didn't have to go to the hospital or anything like that, what could it look like for them as well too in terms of, some may have seen their teacher get killed, some may have seen their classmate get killed, but what does it look like to them to also step foot inside that high school again, and realize it's different. It's not that same feeling of how it's supposed to feel when you go to school. You're supposed to be excited for football games and pep rallies and like trying to overcome or take an exam. But what does it look like for those students as well too who may have not been injured in the shooting but still hearing bullets fly, hearing that your beloved teacher was killed, your classmate was killed? What does it look like for them going forward in this type of circumstance?
When we look at things like post traumatic stress, we look at the proximity of the person to the actual event. Were their lives directly threatened? Did they actually witness people dying? Did they feel like they were going to die? And then we look at other things. Do they have a previous exposure to trauma, a previous history of mental illness? These are things that put you at higher risk for the development of post traumatic stress disorder. But even children who were in the building and who didn't directly witness people dying, just being in that building is traumatic in and of itself. So those students also would be at risk for the development of post traumatic stress disorder.
And overall, what type of long term effects mentally could their surviving victims of the shooting face?
So the good news is that most people are resilient and they will recover from an event like this. But again, given how close they were to the actual event, if their life was directly threatened, they will be at increased risk for post-traumatic stress disorder. And this may look like depression, anxiety, insomnia, and increased risk to develop substance use disorders. So these are all things that we want to watch out for. I would tell you that the most important thing for the younger victims who are involved in an event like this is making sure that they have a sense of safety and security and support. Once they go through something like this, that's really what they're looking for. They need to feel safe, they need to be reassured, and I think that's where the adults and the caregivers come in to provide them with that sense.
I think the term grief comes to mind when you hear about cases like this within the United States, that this is something that happens quite often here in the US. But as far as dealing with this type of grief, for some, this may be the first time they've ever dealt with something so tragic like this. What type of advice would you be giving either the students, the parents, the loved ones who are dealing with this type of grief, never thinking that this would happen at my school, this would happen in my hometown? What type of advice or expertise would you give them in these types of scenarios?
So I would say, there's no one size fits all approach, but there's definitely principles that apply, making sure that they're getting enough sleep, that they're going to sleep the same time every night and waking up the same time every morning, getting on a schedule, having a sense of predictability because predictability promotes stability and safety, making sure that they're having proper nutrition, that they're adequately hydrating, that they're really, engaging in self-care, and that if they find that their daily function is disrupted, they're not able to go to school, they're not able to provide for their hygiene, they're not eating adequately, not sleeping adequately, that it may be time to seek out professional help.
And do you think that, since these are younger kids, they're high school age kids, does the term high functioning, whether it be anxiety or depression, does that come to your mind at all, as in terms of maybe they feel like they just have to do this, whether or not they're really reeling inside from everything that just happened, just even last week? But in terms of like high functioning depression or anxiety, is that something that some of the students who have to go back to school, is that something they could also face?
Well, high functioning is not an officially recognized term within the mental health field, but certainly there are going to be people who are quote unquote high functioning who feel a sense of obligation and responsibility and duty to their studies and to get back into what they were doing. But I would say just take it one day at a time, and sometimes it's even 1 hour at a time, and just to go at your own pace and try to keep your expectations low because you don't want to set yourself up for failure. So I would just say take it slow.
And then another term that also came to mind was, in a way, I guess, trauma bonding. And I say that by meaning that there is a group of people within that high school, within that community, that are all going through the same thing. As far as support and comfort from those who also witnessed the exact same thing, that being the shooting, what does that look like in terms of any type of, I say this loosely, road to recovery, because knowing that it'll never be the same, but what does it do in terms of supporting one another by this trauma that all bonded them together in a way?
I think it could actually be very helpful. I mean, they will be bound together for the rest of their lives because of this tragedy, because of this trauma. And I think there's a sense that, you know what I went through because you went through it too. And those people may actually develop a very deep connection that may be lifelong. So I think those people should try to support each other because certainly they can empathize with each other because they've all gone through it.
And how important are grief counselors in this type of case? Again, everyone went through this horrible thing together in a way, but how important are grief counselors and school resource officers as well too, that could be helpful to a student who might be in need right now?
So I think grief counseling is helpful as long as it's done by trained professionals. For example, there are things like debriefing that could actually make things worse after a trauma. So I think it's all about timing, using evidence-based treatments, and surrounding these kids with people who have the training to deal with people who have been through serious traumas.
All right. Well, Dr. Bober, thank you so much for your insight. I really appreciate your time discussing this case with me. Before we sign you off, is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I think that covers it.
All right. Dr. Bober, thank you again so much. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Both the suspected shooter, Colt Gray, and his father, Colin Gray, are expected to appear in court again for a preliminary hearing on December 4th. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.